want to talk a little bit about the difference between the philosophical construction of cause and effect as opposed to statistical causation. I think we've all heard the term correlation is not causation, and this just means that, two things could be both going up or both going down or seem to be moving in the same direction, but they really don't have anything to do with each other. And there's a lot of examples of this type of thing. Here's one. According to this graphic, people drowning after falling out of a fishing boat would seemingly have something to do with the number of people who get married every year in Kentucky. We can see that they're both going up and down sort of in tandem, but common sense would tell us, well, I don't know, I haven't been to Kentucky, but common sense would probably tell us that these two things don't have anything to do with each other. So that's not really what I want to talk about. There's lots of examples of that on the internet. Google it and you will see. What I want to talk about is the difference again between cause and effect and statistical causation. So let's consider a little boy, say, throwing a baseball, and if he aims it right and throws it hard enough, he can break a window. And I would call this an instance of cause and effect. You do something, and that causes another thing to happen. If you throw the ball hard enough and with good enough aim, and you hit the window, the effect will be that you break the window. So this is the kind of thing that we learn very early in our lives. If I knock over my glass of milk, it'll spill all over the table. Mom and dad might get mad. Those kinds of things. Cause and effect. If you kick a chair, it'll move. If you pull on a ladder, it'll fall down. Cause and effect. Statistical causation is a little bit more complicated. And so I want to talk for a minute about smoking, cigarettes, tobacco here in the U.S. So here's a couple of dudes from Mad Men. Smoking. If you watched that program, you saw plenty of smoking types of behaviors. And that's in part because up until about the 1950s, smoking was encouraged and enjoyed by a lot of people, and we weren't really aware of the health ramifications around tobacco use. There were a lot of ads. I'm old enough to remember some of these. Smoking was a thing that a lot of people did. But then the American Cancer Society started wondering, wait a minute, what's going on here? So these two chaps were working at the American Cancer Society. And in 1952, and going on for 3 years, they followed almost 200,000 men looking at their smoking habits, whether it was from cigarettes or a pipe, how often did they do it, what is their general health. And at the end of this time, they even checked to see, are these men alive? Did they die? Are they doing okay? What's going on? And the conclusion was, we are of the opinion that the associations found between smoking and death rates from diseases of coronary arteries and lung cancer reflect cause and effect relationships. So super unfortunate use of words here for our purposes. What they're really talking about here is statistical causation. They were starting to be able to prove that tobacco use led to these adverse health outcomes. And here they are again. I apparently during the course of all of this work, they became alarmed, and they were both previously heavy cigarette smokers, and they transitioned to pipes before they eventually quit altogether because smoking a pipe is no better. Anyway. Then in 1959, they did an even bigger study. This time, 1 million people were involved, over 1 million actually. They actually included some women, and issued a report that made its way into the White House of John F. Kennedy in 1961. And then in 1964, the Surgeon General's report was issued, and we now have things like labels on tobacco products, restrictions on where those advertisements can show up, things like that. Smoking is a health hazard of sufficient importance in the United States to warrant appropriate remedial action. And what they were getting at here is that they had determined causation. They had been able to determine that tobacco use was a cause of death in these particular kinds of ways. So some of the arguments that you hear when you make claims like this, which one of the points that I'm trying to make here is that it's really hard to show causation. They ended up having to do 2 different studies over years and years, involving hundreds and thousands, millions of people, in order to be able to prove this. And I'm making air quotes here, prove this. So I understand that that there can be some miscomprehensions around this idea of causation. And so here are some of the arguments that I've heard. It can't be true that smoking causes cancer because my relative smoked their whole lives and they never got cancer, or my relative never smoked and yet they died from cancer. A causal effect says, hey, we have some evidence here that this thing looks like it's having an effect on this other thing. What causation does not say is that we offer you a guarantee of any kind that if you smoke or you don't, that we'll be able to tell you at the outset whether or not you will develop any kind of cancer. Of course, no one is able to do that. Look, I'm no doctor. So maybe we should look at an example that is a little bit closer to home. Here's an image of a woman studying. We have reason to believe that this kind of behavior has statistically causal effects on the kinds of grades that you get. Does this mean that if you study, you have some kind of guarantee that you're going to do well? We all know from personal experience that that is not always the case. Does this mean that if you don't study that you can't do well? I've certainly walked into a test that I thought I was going to bomb and was happily surprised to find out that I didn't. Or that we've all seen both of these things, but we know that preparing for a test has a causal effect of our outcomes in terms of grades. And so I just wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between everyday cause and effect and statistical causation. Hopefully this helps to clarify things a little bit.